What happens when one of the biggest stars in the world sits down for what should be a simple morning chat, only to face a barrage of disrespectful questions that cross every line imaginable? In just 36 seconds, a celebrated television host would destroy his own reputation with comments so outrageous, so deeply inappropriate, that his guest would have no choice but to walk off set in front of millions of viewers. Jennifer Lopez arrived at the Good Morning America studio that morning expecting a standard promotional interview. She had a new project to discuss, fans to connect with, and a few minutes of her incredibly busy schedule carved out for what was supposed to be a pleasant conversation. She walked onto that set with a smile, radiating the professionalism and warmth she's known for after decades in the entertainment industry. Michael Strahan greeted her as the cameras began rolling, and for the first minute or so, everything seemed normal. The usual pleasantries were exchanged. He asked about her recent work, and she answered with enthusiasm, clearly excited to share what she'd been working on. But then something shifted. You could see it in his posture, in the way he leaned back in his chair with a smirk that suggested he had something planned, something he thought would make for great television. "So, Jennifer," he began, and there was already an edge to his voice that hadn't been there moments before. "A lot of people have been talking about your personal life lately." Jennifer's smile remained, though it tightened just slightly at the corners. "Well, I'm here to talk about my work, actually," she responded, her tone still friendly, but with a hint of redirection. She was giving him an out, a chance to steer back to professional territory. But Strahan didn't take it. Instead, he pressed forward. Sure, but you have to admit, your relationships have always been a big part of your public image. Some might say you're better known for who you're dating than what you're actually doing career-wise." The air in the studio changed instantly. The crew members glanced at each other. This wasn't a typical interview question. This was a jab, thinly veiled as journalism. Jennifer's expression shifted from warm to guarded. "I think that's pretty disrespectful, Michael," she said calmly, maintaining her composure. "I've been in this industry for over 30 years. I've sold millions of records, starred in dozens of films, built businesses, and created opportunities for other artists. To reduce all of that to gossip about my dating life is incredibly dismissive." Any reasonable person would have apologized at this point, would have acknowledged they'd overstepped and moved the conversation forward. But Strahan, whether driven by ego or a misguided belief that controversy makes for compelling content, doubled down instead. "Come on, don't be so sensitive," he said, actually chuckling as if her legitimate grievance was somehow amusing. "You put your life out there. You can't be upset when people talk about it. That's the game, right? You use your relationships for publicity, and then get mad when someone asks about them." Jennifer's jaw tightened. Her hands, which had been relaxed in her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair. "Excuse me," she said, her voice lower now, more controlled, but with steel underneath. "Are you seriously suggesting that my personal relationships are publicity stunts? That I use the people I care about for attention?" "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Strahan continued, and now his tone had shifted to something almost condescending, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child. "You're always in the tabloids with someone new. It's a pattern, and patterns usually mean strategy." The audacity of this statement hung in the air. Here was a man on national television suggesting that one of the most successful entertainers in the world was fabricating her personal life for fame, as if she needed such tactics, as if her talent and work ethic weren't enough. Jennifer sat perfectly still for a moment, processing what she'd just heard. "Michael," she began, and her voice was remarkably steady given the circumstances. "I came here as a courtesy. I came here to talk about my work, to connect with people who support me, and to share something I'm proud of. What I'm not here for is to be insulted by someone who clearly hasn't done his homework about who I am or what I've accomplished." But Strahan wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by the tension, perhaps mistaking conflict for good television. "Oh, I've done my homework, he shot back. Everyone knows your story. Multiple marriages, multiple engagements, always a new romance making headlines. At some point, you have to ask yourself if maybe the problem isn't everyone else. The collective gasp from the crew was almost audible. This had gone from inappropriate to cruel. He was essentially calling her the problem in her own relationships, suggesting some fundamental flaw in her character, and doing it all with cameras rolling and millions watching. It was character assassination disguised as conversation. Jennifer's face went from controlled frustration to something else entirely. This wasn't just anger. This was the look of someone realizing they were sitting across from a person with no boundaries, no respect, and no intention of treating them with basic human dignity. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet but clear. You know what, Michael? I've sat through difficult interviews before. I've handled tough questions, critical press, people who wanted to provoke me or get a reaction. But what you're doing right now isn't journalism. It's not even entertainment. It's just mean. And it's coming from a place of something I can't quite figure out. But it definitely isn't professionalism. Strahan leaned forward, his expression morphing into something that looked like fake concern, the kind of look someone gives when they're pretending to be sincere. Jennifer, I think you're overreacting. These are legitimate questions that your fans want answers to. My fans? Jennifer repeated, and now there was a hint of disbelief in her voice. My fans love and support me. They don't need you to attack me on their behalf. And these aren't legitimate questions, Michael. These are insults wrapped in questions. There's a difference, and if you can't see that, then maybe you shouldn't be sitting in that chair. The tension was suffocating now. Other hosts at the desk looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The producers off camera were likely panicking, trying to figure out how to salvage what had become a disaster. But Strahan, incredibly, kept going. I think you're being defensive because there's truth to what I'm saying, he stated, his voice taking on an almost accusatory tone now. Successful women in this industry usually have thick skin. They can handle a little pushback without falling apart. And there it was, the implication that she was weak, that her objection to being disrespected was somehow a character flaw, that standing up for herself meant she couldn't handle criticism. It was gaslighting in real time, an attempt to make her reasonable response seem unreasonable. Jennifer stood up, not dramatically, not with a flourish, but with the quiet dignity of someone who knows their worth and refuses to be diminished. I'm not falling apart, Michael, she said, looking directly at him. I'm making a choice. I'm choosing not to sit here and let you disrespect me for ratings or clicks or whatever you think you're gaining from this. I've worked too hard and come too far to let anyone, including you, treat me like I'm less than what I am. She reached up and removed her microphone, the small clip making a soft sound as it detached. Strahan's expression shifted then, as if he was only now realizing that this wasn't going according to whatever script he'd imagined. Jennifer, come on. Sit back down. Let's talk about this like adults. She paused and looked at him one more time. Adults show each other respect, Michael. They don't mock each other's personal lives. They don't make cruel implications about their character, and they certainly don't try to manipulate someone into accepting bad treatment by calling them sensitive. I'm an adult. That's exactly why I'm leaving. The camera operators didn't know where to point their equipment. Do you keep filming? Do you cut away? This was unprecedented, a complete breakdown of the standard morning show format. Jennifer began walking off the set, her heels clicking against the floor, each step an assertion of her boundaries and self-respect. Strahan called after her, and now his voice had a different quality, something almost desperate. We still have 8 minutes left in the segment. Jennifer didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Her point had been made. One of the producers rushed over to Strahan, whispering urgently, probably trying to figure out how to fill the sudden void in their programming. Another staff member followed Jennifer off set, likely apologizing profusely, understanding that their show had just committed a massive blunder. Back at the desk, Strahan tried to recover, attempting to address the camera with some semblance of normalcy. Well, clearly Jennifer had somewhere else to be, he said, attempting a joke that fell completely flat. The other hosts beside him looked mortified, their expressions revealing what everyone was thinking. This was bad, really bad, and it was entirely his fault. What had started as a routine celebrity interview had devolved into a masterclass in how not to treat a guest, how not to conduct an interview, and how not to behave as a professional. Strahan had apparently believed that he could say whatever he wanted, cross whatever lines he chose, and his position as host would protect him from consequences. He'd believed that Jennifer would simply sit there and take it, that she would prioritize the show over her own dignity. He'd been wrong. The beautiful thing about Jennifer's exit was its simplicity. She didn't scream, didn't throw anything, didn't create a scene in the dramatic sense. She simply exercised her right to leave a situation where she wasn't being treated with basic respect. It was powerful precisely because it was calm, because it showed that you don't have to accept mistreatment just because someone has a microphone and a camera. In the final moments before she disappeared backstage, Jennifer's posture remained perfect, her head held high. There was no defeat in her departure, only dignity. She'd given Strahan multiple chances to correct course, multiple opportunities to steer the interview back to respectful territory. She'd been patient and professional, even as he became increasingly inappropriate. And when it became clear that he had no intention of treating her properly, she made the only choice that respected both her time and her worth. Strahan sat at that desk, trying to transition to the next segment, but the energy was gone. The show had imploded, and everyone watching knew exactly who was responsible. He'd had one of the biggest stars in the world sitting across from him, ready to give a great interview, ready to be charming and engaging, and give the audience exactly what they tuned in for. Instead, he'd chosen to be antagonistic, to demean her, to suggest that her accomplishments were overshadowed by tabloid fodder and that her personal life was some kind of calculated publicity strategy. It was a staggering display of poor judgment, made worse by his refusal to back down even when given multiple chances. Each question had been worse than the last, each comment more insulting. He'd treated her personal relationships, her marriages, her life as if they were material for his entertainment rather than real experiences belonging to a real person. And when she'd objected, he'd tried to paint her objection as oversensitivity rather than the completely reasonable response it was. The worst part was the gaslighting, the suggestion that her reaction was the problem rather than his behavior. That particular tactic, trying to convince someone that their justified anger is actually them being dramatic or difficult, is especially insidious. It's an attempt to maintain power by making the other person question their own judgment. Jennifer didn't fall for it. She knew what she'd experienced, knew what had been said to her, and knew she deserved better. As the show cut to commercial, the damage was done. The interview that was supposed to promote Jennifer's work, that was supposed to be a positive moment for both the guest and the show, had instead become a cautionary tale. It showed what happens when ego overrides. Professionalism. When a host forgets that their job is to facilitate conversation, not to attack their guests for sport. Jennifer's choice to walk away was radical in its simplicity. In an industry where celebrities are often expected to endure all manner of inappropriate questions and comments with a smile, where speaking up is frequently portrayed as being difficult or high maintenance, she'd drawn a clear line. She'd shown that there's nothing wrong with removing yourself from a hostile situation, that staying and tolerating disrespect isn't strength, but rather a betrayal of self. For Strahan, the realization was likely setting in that he'd made a catastrophic error. You don't insult someone of Jennifer's stature and walk away unscathed. You don't treat a guest poorly on live television and expect there to be no consequences. The entertainment industry has a long memory, and this moment would define how people saw him for a long time to come. The irony was that he'd probably thought he was being edgy, thought he was asking the tough questions that would make for compelling television. But there's a difference between tough questions and cruel ones, between journalism and harassment. A skilled interviewer can ask challenging questions while still maintaining respect for their subject. They can explore difficult topics without demeaning the person sitting across from them. Strahan had shown none of that skill, none of that nuance. What made Jennifer's response so powerful was that it wasn't about revenge or getting even. It was simply about self-preservation and self-respect. She didn't owe anyone her presence in a situation that was actively hostile to her. She didn't owe Strahan the opportunity to continue disparaging her for the sake of his show's ratings. She owed herself the dignity of walking away, and that's exactly what she provided. The segment had started with such promise. A beloved entertainer, a popular morning show, a chance for connection and promotion. It should have been easy. All Strahan had to do was be respectful, ask about her work, maybe throw in one or two personal questions that were tasteful and relevant. Instead, he'd chosen aggression, chosen to frame her entire career through the lens of her romantic relationships, chosen to suggest she was somehow less legitimate because of tabloid coverage she didn't even control. Every step Jennifer took toward that exit was a statement. It said that her time was valuable. It said that her dignity was non-negotiable. It said that being a public figure doesn't mean accepting abuse as part of the job description. And most importantly, it said that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in your own degradation. The cameras had captured it all. The initial warmth, the gradual shift in tone, the mounting tension, the multiple chances given and wasted, and finally, the quiet but definitive exit. It was all there for anyone to see. A complete record of how an interview can go wrong when one person decides that creating conflict is more important than creating conversation. Strahan's attempts to justify or minimize his comments, both during and after Jennifer began to leave, only made things worse. They revealed someone who either genuinely didn't understand what he'd done wrong or who understood perfectly, but was too proud to admit it. Either way, it didn't matter. The damage was done, the line was crossed, and Jennifer was gone. In those final moments, as she walked through the studio and toward the exit, she carried herself with the poise of someone who knows exactly who they are. There was no doubt, no second guessing, no worried glances back. She'd made her decision based on how she was being treated, and she was comfortable with that decision. That kind of clarity, that kind of self-assurance comes from decades of experience, from knowing your worth and refusing to negotiate it. The show would go on, but it would go on without her. Strahan would finish his hosting duties for the day, but he'd finish them under a cloud of his own making. The other segments would air, the commercials would run, the credits would roll, but none of it would change what had happened, what had been said, and how spectacularly it had all fallen apart. What should have been a highlight of the morning show circuit had become its lowest moment. What could have been a masterclass in celebrity interviewing had become a cautionary tale about what not to do. And what might have been a pleasant conversation between two professionals had become a demonstration of what happens when one person forgets that basic respect isn't optional. It's essential. Jennifer Lopez had arrived ready to share, ready to connect, ready to be the gracious and engaging guest she'd been hundreds of times before. She'd left because staying would have required accepting unacceptable treatment. The choice was hers to make, and she made it, with the confidence of someone who knows that walking away from disrespect is never the wrong decision, no matter who's watching or what the setting might be. The studio fell into an awkward silence after her departure, the kind of silence that screams louder than any words could. The production assistant stood frozen, unsure of their next move. The other hosts at the desk exchanged glances that communicated everything without saying anything. This wasn't supposed to happen. Morning shows thrive on pleasant conversation, light humor, feel-good moments. What they'd just witnessed was the opposite of all that. Strahan's co-hosts tried to help him save face, one of them offering a weak smile and saying something about moving on to the next topic. But their efforts felt hollow because everyone knew what they'd just seen. They'd watched a host systematically dismantle what should have been an easy, enjoyable interview through sheer arrogance and poor judgment. What made the whole thing even more striking was the contrast between the two people involved. Jennifer had maintained her composure throughout, even as she was being provoked. She'd responded to each inappropriate comment with measured words, giving Strahan chance after chance to correct his behavior. Strahan, on the other hand, had started with subtle jabs and escalated to outright character attacks, showing less control with each passing minute. The audience watching at home had seen it all unfold in real time. They'd watched someone they admired being treated poorly, and they'd watched her handle it with grace before making the decision to leave. That kind of authenticity resonates in ways that scripted television never can. For Jennifer, walking off that set was about more than just one bad interview. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that tolerance for mistreatment has limits. In an industry where public figures often endure uncomfortable situations for the sake of publicity, her willingness to simply say no and leave was almost revolutionary. The thing about boundaries is that they only work if you're willing to enforce them. Jennifer had verbally established her boundaries multiple times during the interview. When Strahan repeatedly violated those boundaries, she enforced them in the most definitive way possible by removing herself. It was a lesson in self-advocacy that went far beyond celebrity drama. Back at the desk, Strahan had to continue hosting as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just driven away one of the most famous people in the world. The show must go on, as they say, but going on doesn't mean forgetting. The viewers wouldn't forget. The industry wouldn't forget. The countdown to her exit had started the moment he made that first dismissive comment. Every subsequent remark had been another step toward the inevitable conclusion. It was like watching a slow-motion disaster, where you could see the crash coming, but couldn't stop it, because the person in control refused to change course. Jennifer's measured responses throughout showed someone who understood exactly what was happening. She could have matched his hostility. She could have made a bigger scene, but she didn't. Instead, she took the high road, maintained her dignity, and simply removed herself when it became clear that respect wasn't going to be forthcoming. The power dynamic in that interview room had been interesting to observe. On paper, Strahan had the power. He was the host. It was his show. But Jennifer had shown that real power comes from self-respect and the willingness to walk away when a situation isn't serving you. She didn't need his show or his approval, and that independence gave her all the power she needed. As she disappeared from view, she left behind a studio full of people processing what had just occurred. Some were probably angry at Strahan for creating such a mess. Some were probably worried about the fallout. Some were probably just shocked that it had escalated so quickly. But all of them had learned something about what happens when you mistake cruelty for courage. The interview had lasted less than 10 minutes from start to finish, but those minutes would be dissected and discussed for far longer. Every comment would be analyzed. Every facial expression would be scrutinized. Every moment of tension would be replayed and examined. And through all of that analysis, one thing would remain crystal clear. Jennifer Lopez had been the professional, and Michael Strahan had not. The beautiful simplicity of her exit stood in stark contrast to the complexity of what had led to it. Walking away is often portrayed as giving up or backing down, but in this case, it was neither. It was an assertion of value, a refusal to participate in something degrading, and a reminder that everyone, regardless of fame or status, deserves basic human respect in their interactions with others.